Hi everyone, my name is Rachel and welcome to the French Seams. Thanks very much for joining me for today's video. This is a little tutorial about how I put neck bindings into my me-made garments. I've had a few requests for this and I'm really keen to share how I do it. I am by no means an expert, I am not a professional, but this is how I do it and I really like this technique and how it comes out. So I show you two ways of doing it. This is a half finished garment, and in this one I've put in a strip of jersey binding. It's just a 1-inch strip of jersey leftover scraps. I put in a little label. I show you how to do this way, and then I also show you how to do it in a garment that is already made. This is an LB pullover that I've made, so you can add this binding retrospectively to garments. For this version I've put in a strip of pre-made bias, and this is woven bias. So it's a really lovely technique. It doesn't take long and you can do it to most garments. I think it looks really nice. In this one it's just a strip of jersey, as I said before. It is slightly easier to put this in because the garment is only half finished, so it's easier to get at the neckline. In this one it is a fully finished garment, so it's a little bit trickier because you're working with more fabric, but in this one using a woven binding it's a little bit easier because the woven binding is a little bit more stable. So for the jersey, all you need is a strip of jersey fabric, cotton jersey, whatever you have lying around, about 1 inch wide and however long it is to take you from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. And in this one I use the Specky Seamstress pre-made bias binding, and again you just need a strip that will take you from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. I think it gives a really lovely finish. On each of them I pop in a little label. This one is from Cozy Club Handmade and this one is from Little Rosy Cheeks. I think it's a lovely opportunity to put them into your me-made garments. Just a word on doing the binding, I only ever put them on the back neck seam because of course you still need the stretch to get the garment over your head, so be sure to only put it on the back. I increase my stitch length to about 3.2, something like that. I think it makes it easier to put in. And then also you'll need a thread that'll match your binding on this side and then also match your garment on the back, because you will have one seam along the back. So without further ado, I'll show you how I do it. The first method I'm going to show you is with a jersey neck binding, and this is a strip of binding about 1 inch wide. You basically need as long as will stretch from shoulder seam to shoulder seam, that way that it'll be the ends will be hidden when you show the inside of the garment. This is a half made garment, so this is a Tilly and the Buttons Billy sweatshirt. So I've sewn the shoulder seams and overlocked them. I've basted in the neckband and I'm just about to serge off and overlock the edges here to give our nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's not necessary to do this on a half finished garment. You can of course do this on an entirely finished garment. It just makes it ever so slightly easier if you don't have any sleeves or anything like that, because you can get at the back neckband easier, but it's not a game changer at all. So I'm going to overlock the edge here to make this seam allowance here 1/4 inch, and I've got my 1 inch strip of binding and I've pressed up one side 1/4 inch. Again, that's not entirely necessary, but it just helps to fold it over when the time comes. I've now turned the sweatshirt inside out. You can see here's the back neckband seam, and starting on the left shoulder as you're wearing it, you can see here's the shoulder seam. If you gather up your piece of binding and on the side that isn't the folded edge, if you tuck under this maybe about by 1/4 inch to give a nice finish, and then just around the shoulder seam, if you place it right sides together like this along the neckband and put a little pin in this, what we're going to do is we're going to sew the entire length of this all the way around to the other shoulder seam, keeping your 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way along here. You can follow your overlocker guide seam all the way along here. We're going to sew it all the way along the neckband, curving as we go until we get to the other side of the garments, the other shoulder seam. When you get to the other shoulder seam, as you're coming close, you can trim down your neck binding and fold under the edge a little tiny bit, again like we did at the start, to give a nice finish. So I'm going to use thread that matches here, so I'm going to use white thread for doing the initial one, but then when we change to the next step, when we're actually going to sew the binding down, you do need to have matching thread, because that means that you'll see the stitch line on this side, but you will also see one line of stitching on the back, so be sure to change your thread colour and your bobbin colour when we come to that stage. So I've now sewn the neck binding to the neck band. So here's our edge that we tucked in. I've sewn it at 1/4 inch all the way along here, only catching the existing seam allowance, all the way along to the other side of the neckband at the shoulder seam. I've tucked in this side as well to give it a nice finish. You can see if I fold this down, there's no extra seam line here because I kept the existing seam allowance. And as it stands now, there's no extra line on the back of the garment. So what we're going to do now is, and this is why you pressed down a 1/4 inch earlier, it might help you. You fold down the entire binding and then use that 1/4 inch to tuck it under the existing seam allowance, and then fold the whole thing down again, pull up your neckband, and this is what we're going to sew down. So we're going to edge stitch all the way along here, all the way from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. So you might need to kind of wrangle it ever so slightly. So pull up the neckband, fold down the binding, it might help to give it a little press, tuck it under the seam allowance and fold it down again. Of course, you can pin it if you like. And this is what we're going to sew to our garment. So I'm going to change my thread color now. I'm going to have a kind of a pinky one for this side. And then in my bobbin, I'm going to have a nice dark blue here so that it kind of blends in. So I'm going to change my thread colors and I'm going to fold this down. And then starting again from the left shoulder seam, I'm going to edge stitch all the way along here from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. And here it is all sewn. So you can see I've gone from shoulder seam to shoulder seam, tucked it in nicely at either end. It's also a lovely opportunity to put in a little label when you get to the centre back seam. I think it makes it look really, really neat and tidy. You can see I've just edge stitched all the way along here in a pink thread. And then on the back, all you can see is just one line of blue stitching. So that's how you do the back neckline with a jersey neckband. Next, we're going to put in a woven binding into an existing garment. So this is the LB pullover that I've made recently. You can see that I've overlocked the neckline here, and we're going to use this really pretty binding. This is from the Specky Seamstress, Little Daisies. Using a woven binding is exactly the same as using a knit binding. The method is exactly the same. It's ever so slightly easier because the binding has already been pressed for you, and because it's woven, it's a little bit more stable. But the technique is exactly the same. We're going to do it from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. We're going to tuck in the two edges to give it a nice finish. We're going to turn the garment inside out, and we're going to put the binding on the seam allowance, sew that down, fold it down and tuck it under. So I'll show you how to do that now. So here's a sweatshirt that I've turned inside out. This is the back of it. You can see the back neckband seam. Starting at the left hand shoulder seam as you're wearing it, you get your binding and you fold down the edges ever so slightly, maybe about a 1/4 inch. And then right sides to right sides, you line it up with the seam allowance. You just have to be careful sometimes, as some pre-made bindings have a direction on them. So just make sure that when you flap it down like this, it will actually show the design or the writing the right way up. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sew all the way along the pre-pressed line here. But the only thing to make sure is that this press line lines up with your existing seam allowance here. So this line here. So sometimes it's useful to, when you've got it against the edge here, right sides to right sides with raw edges together, to flap it up like this, just to make sure that you're following that existing line. So we're going to sew all the way along from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. When you get to the other shoulder seam, again, tuck this end in ever so slightly and then sew it down like this, and that'll give a nice finish. So I've now sewn the neck binding to the garment, shoulder seam to shoulder seam. You can see my line of stitching on the inside here, so it follows the seam allowance exactly, so there's no visible line of stitching on the inside of the garment and there's none currently on the outside. The next step now is a little bit easier because we're using woven binding as opposed to the jersey one we used previously. Again, you just use the pre-press line to fold that over the seam allowance and then flap that down, bring the neckband up. And we're just going to edge stitch all the way along this edge here. So it's a little bit easier with the woven binding because of that pre-pressed edge. It just seems to want to curve itself under the seam allowance anyway, which makes it a little bit easier. So again, starting at the left shoulder seam, we're just going to edge stitch all the way along here. I find it easier to increase my stitch length, maybe to about 2.8 or 3. And also sometimes it's also easier if you remove this bit of your sewing machine, just so you can get it under the needle a little bit easier. So we're going to fold this down, make sure the edge of the binding is tucked in under the seam allowance, and edge stitch using a thread matching your binding, and then also a bobbin matching the back of your garment. And here's the finished neck binding. So I've sewn it down shoulder seam to shoulder seam using black thread here, so you can't really see it, and then just using pink in the bobbin, giving one little line of stitching on the back of the garment. And I've popped in a little Cozy Club handmade label, Hello Summer, and that is how to do your woven binding. So I hope you found that useful. So here's another look at my blue jumper, and this is the lovely pink binding on the inside. And then on my pink jumper, I've got the beautiful daisy binding on the inside and the little label, and I think it looks really, really nice. On both of these versions, on the front neckband, I've just sewn down the seam allowance there. I think it gives a lovely finish, so I've just done one line of little top stitching all the way along here, again in a matching thread, and I've also done that on my pink version as well, just to hold down the seam allowance. I think it gives overall a really lovely finish. So this is how I do the two neck bindings. I really hope that was useful. If you have any questions on this, please leave me a message in the comment box below. I'd be very happy to answer any and all questions you have on this technique. I really hope you give it a go. I really hope you enjoy doing it. If you do give it a go, be sure to let me know how you get on. So if you did enjoy this tutorial, I'd very much like it if you'd give me a thumbs up, and please consider subscribing as well to my channel, where I chat about all things sewing. I hope you're all well. I hope you're all having time for some lovely, lovely sewing, and I'll catch you all again in another video. Take care, everyone. Bye.